Unfortunately for evolutionists, insertions are rarer than deletions. Thus, in the human gene mutation database, there are 3 times more deletions than insertions. Evolutionists do not have one good example of a beneficial mutation that adds information to the genome, and yet they want you to believe this has happened billions of times. Change does occur in nature. The question is, in what direction? The evidence indicates the direction is from order to disorder. Useful change is the exception, not the rule. And the fourth point, millions of years. Let's say you walked into a house that had been vacant for a year and found a lit candle burning on the table. Would you assume that it had been burning for a year? No, of course not. But that's very like the position the evolutionists are in. You see, the candle that's burning is radioactive carbon-14. Its half-life is only 5,730 years. Now, the ratio of normal carbon-12 to carbon-14 is 1 trillion to 1. So there's not much carbon-14 to start with, and it burns fast. After only 100,000 years, that's about 18 half-lives, any carbon-14 that might remain is so minute that it's undetectable by current techniques. But there's a problem. Carbon deposits like natural gas, oil, coal, and even fossils, which are supposed to be 65 million to 460 million years old, have measurable amounts of radioactive carbon-14. Naturally, the first thought is the samples are contaminated. However, after careful investigation, it has been determined that most of the radioactive carbon-14 is actually from the sample. In fact, radioactive carbon-14 is even inside the hardest substance, diamonds. Yet diamonds are thought to be 2 billion years old or older. After you control for contamination, and still we have radioactive carbon-14 in the samples, the only reasonable conclusion is that the samples are less than 100,000 years old, and that does not leave enough time for evolution. So why do so many smart people believe in evolution? It's because of their a priori assumptions. Assumptions they're not comfortable in changing.
Do you want to introduce yourself and let me know when you're ready?
Evolution. Now, of course, the scientists have already had their debate about evolution. The scientific question of the validity of evolution has been settled for well over 100 years. What debates like this one today are about is education. Should we have science education based on science or based on religion? The anti-evolutionists can't convince scientists that evolution is false, but they can convince school boards, where the school boards don't know any better. They can convince large segments of public opinion when the public is ignorant enough. They've worked out some very effective methods for this. One is how they frame the debate, the terminology they use, and the dichotomies they set up. To begin with, they identify themselves as the creationists. And unfortunately, most people go along with that designation. This is very misleading. Probably a large majority of the world's population are creationists. They believe a divine power or powers created the world, but only a small minority of creationists are anti-evolutionists. So, creationists largely fashioned the theory of evolution in the first place. And some evolutionary biologists today are devout Christian creationists. So let's call anti-evolutionists what they are, anti-evolutionists. They don't have a monopoly on creation. They're also good at misdefining and misusing words. They like to say that evolution is just a theory, not a fact. That use of the word theory does accord with common colloquial usage. We say it's just theoretical, it's not real. But in science, theory is a very strong, very positive term. An idea is not a theory, a speculation is not a theory, a hypothesis is not a theory. Theory means explanation, a well thought out, coherent explanation that ties together a lot of facts. You can accumulate mountains of facts, data we call them, but they don't mean anything until you have a theory to tie them together and highlight the underlying patterns. Of course, evolution is a theory. It explains things. And the anti-evolutionists have no alternative theory to offer. They only have an assertion. Evolution doesn't happen. And God created all the animals on the 5th and 6th days of the universe, I think it was. They like to call evolution Darwinism or neo-Darwinism, as if it were one person's idea, with the implication that if Darwin was wrong about anything, evolution comes tumbling down. This is like calling the theory of gravitation Newtonism. We've come a long way since Darwin and Newton. The next thing they do is tell their audience, you have to make a choice. It's evolution or creation. You can't have both. We've already seen that this is blatantly false. In logic, it's called a false dichotomy. The false conclusion the anti-evolutionists want people to draw from it is that if they can score a point against evolution, it's the same as scoring a point for their religious doctrine. This is like saying that if I didn't go to Chicago last week, I must have gone to San Francisco. It just doesn't follow. Another false dichotomy is design or blind chance. Well, folks, most of what happens in the universe is neither design nor blind chance. It's what is known as cause and effect. You often hear anti-evolutionists complain that they don't get a fair hearing because the scientific establishment is against them. I often wonder how they think that happened. How did the scientific establishment come to accept evolution as one of the most solidly established scientific theories ever known? Well, as is normal with new theories, first they rejected it, then they studied it, then they looked at piles and piles and piles of evidence, and after nitpicking and arguing for years, they found that evolution really works. It explains the data. Darwin did not invent the idea of evolution. What Darwin did was transform that idea into an effective theory. He amassed relevant data, and he came up with a principle that tied it all together, natural selection. And of course, Sir Charles Lyell did not invent the geologic column, as you might think from Mike's brochure. Lyell studied the geologic column and explained it better than anyone had before. Ever since the 17th century, naturalists and scholars had been noticing and writing about the layers of rock visible in canyons, cliffs, mines, quarries, and outcrops. There were several different ideas as how the layers had been formed, but everyone agreed that the bottom layers had come first and the upper layers had been laid down in succession. It was also obvious that in places the layers had been disturbed, sometimes violently. When naturalists compared the layering in different locations, they found that the same sequences of rock layers turned up again and again over wide areas. They also noticed that the same layers often contained the same kinds of fossils. There was no way of dating either rocks or fossils absolutely, but relative dates are pretty darn clear. In the late 1700s, the German geologist Abraham Werner compiled a detailed classification of rock layers. The oldest bottom layers he called primary. On top of them were the secondary and tertiary groups, each containing many layers. Primary rocks had no visible fossils. Secondary rocks had lots of marine life fossils, and land animals and plants showed up in tertiary rocks. Once the sequence of fossils had been established by when they showed up in the sequence of rocks, then fossils could be used to put rocks into sequence when it wasn't immediately clear. Nobody had more than the foggiest idea of how old the rocks and their fossils were. It simply seemed obvious to all scientific observers that it must have taken an awesomely long time for those many distinct layers of rock to form.